I think that this is a nice moment. We've scoped sort of the orphan disease landscape, and in that discussion we've actually identified some challenges, scientific challenges, the regulatory challenges, and then market access, reimbursement challenges, which I'd like us now to further explore. So if we look at the scientific challenges, Wills, you mentioned the fact that, okay, there has been progress, but there are many, many more diseases. What, in the first instance, I guess, has been I think what has driven all this, and the initial interest, the scientific interest from the commercial end, was the creation at 1983 of the Orphan Drug Designation Act in the States, and then subsequently we've had similar legislation here in Europe and also in Japan. So what has been the impact, though, do you actually think? Is it because of that legislation that we're now where we are, or is there something else that has also managed to drive it? I mean, do we have orphan disease interest because we actually had some initial successes and people recognize it's actually worth doing?
I think the answer, speaking from a company perspective, the answer clearly has to be yes. I mean, the Orphan Drug Act in the USA has been described as one of the most successful pieces of legislation ever. The orphan regulation here in Europe, as I've just referred to earlier, we've got more than 70 drugs now with a positive opinion. And that compares to just 8 drugs before this was created. So obviously something's happening, and I think we can say these pieces of legislation are extremely important. But they're not, they can't exist just on their own. They are a very, very important piece of the puzzle. I must stress this, it's a very, very important piece of the puzzle. But they are just one piece of the puzzle. And I think what the regulations have done is they've stimulated R&D, research and development, on diseases where we understand very clearly the underlying mechanism of action so that we can proceed to getting a therapy in development to get a designation. But that on its own is not enough, of course. We need to have strong academic research, and we need to have a pathway to market after you hopefully have come up with your successfully proved therapeutic. So the orphan regulation, extremely important, but needs to be also supported by the academic community, and then the gateway to the market, the gateway to the patients. Because the therapy is not worth anything if the patients don't get to take it.
Looking at the legislation we have in orphan drug designation, are there places where you'd like to see it improved? I mean, could the European Union or the US or Japan, could those sort of health agencies, could they come up with improvements to the existing legislation that would facilitate even more activity?
I think the regulatory framework, certainly in Europe, is doing a very good job. And it's intended, and we should be very clear about what it covers. It covers the marketing authorization process for an orphan drug. So it doesn't cover upstream academic research, and it doesn't cover downstream patient collaboration, the registries, the ongoing follow-up, and the market access piece. So what I would say is the orphan drug regulation here in Europe is doing a very, very good job. We should safeguard it, we should keep it, but we should also respect what it can do and what it can't do. And that's why the next piece is the market access piece, and that has to be done together with the countries. But having said that, all the countries in Europe signed up to the Council recommendation in June 2009. Every single health minister signed a piece of paper saying that they were going to create a national plan for rare diseases in each and every single member state. So the tools are there, the governments are committed, we just have to work with them, again, collaboration, to find out the best way to do this in a practical sense in each individual country.
Mike, maybe one thing that I would just add to that from a global perspective, and I agree with Will, certainly that we are getting drugs approved, and so the process is working. But I think that there are some areas for improvement, and certainly I would like to see more harmonization across countries. So you even take the EMA and the FDA have very, very different approaches towards clinical development. And this is applied, you know, across all types of drugs. And so it makes it particularly challenging, I would say, in an area of orphan diseases where there are very limited numbers of patients to study. If we had a similar approach, I think we would find clinical development happening much, much faster. Now, I think, you know, there are some signs of collaboration across geographies, and the recent ICH guidelines on biomarker qualification, I think, is a sign that there is good dialogue between the US, EU, and Japan, and I would certainly like to see that progressed so that we're not seeing, you know, clinical studies that require placebo control in the US, and yet, if one is available, an active control in the EU. So, whilst I think it's working well, there are certainly improvements that can be made.
So current regulatory pathways that exist, are they fit for purpose here in Europe or in the US or Japan, or there's a lot of work still to do?
I think there's a lot of work still to do, and you know, Hans may want to say, but I think that there are real challenges around in poorly understood disease areas where endpoints are challenging to have even more dialogue and collaboration with regulators. And, you know, harmonization, even things like inspections and things, if what we really want to do is to get treatments to patients more quickly, then, you know, even simple things like having shared inspection reports or things would really help enormously in speeding the approval process.
I can absolutely echo that comment, because yes, on the one hand, a lot of harmonization discussions are ongoing, which is great. There's more and more understanding also at the regulators and the payers that the rare disease space is a bit different in a way. But at the same time, a lot of work needs to be done there still. For example, Prosensa is working currently on 6 compounds for one disease, for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And all these compounds are targeted at specific subpopulations of patients. Now, of course, what we would hope is that once you come to the 3rd or 4th product for the same patients, albeit with a small genetic difference, that same class of product does not have to undergo the same lengthy development pathways as for the first products. And we are in discussions with the authorities in order to overcome that issue, but that's a typical hurdle which we are facing in the presence of very small patient numbers. I mean, in diabetes, it's common that you have trials with 10,000 patients. Well, for some of our compounds, there are less than 1,000 patients if you go to smaller subpopulations. So you just can't find the patients to do the trials. So it's quite a challenge. And I see a lot of understanding, albeit a long way to go still, at the regulators.
One of the areas actually that, talking about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, I think is really important is actually how the orphan regulation interacts with other pieces of regulation. Because I know, for example, that in the field of pediatrics, we have the pediatrics regulation in Europe, and that interacts then with the orphan drug regulation. And at a certain moment, you risk a stacking, let's say, of requirements. So not only might you have an unrealistic number of patients which you're required to get into your clinical trial, but then you have to do a pediatric study, and then you have to break down the pediatric study into the different subpopulations. And before you know it, in trying to make everything 100% perfect, you end up with a sum of almost zero, or a risk of not being able to achieve anything. And if the objective is to get treatment to patients, if we're not careful by stacking so many requirements on one individual compound, we risk killing it by accident. And I think really in the orphan drug space, almost more than anywhere else, beyond collaboration, I think we've got to have common sense as our general guiding principle. To understand this is a rare space with rare and scattered expertise, and rare and scattered patients. So we've got to be realistic about what we can expect in such a way that we ensure a robust pathway, but without accidentally killing off the compound by mistake.
So we've talked about the need for collaboration and sort of various stakeholders. So is in fact one of the stakeholders where there needs to be collaboration with is actually the regulators, and the regulators become almost like an active participant in the sort of the development, I guess the drug development.
The EMA is very against us calling them partners in drug development. I think individually, each one of us has probably had our wrists slapped at one point for saying that the Medicines Agency should be a partner in the process. They're very clear. They are not a partner in the process. But having said that, I do think there is a very strong role for the regulators to play in helping us get our treatments through the research and development and authorization process. And I would argue in Europe we have a much better framework than in many parts of the world. I mean, first of all, we can get protocol assistance, so free advice on how to design our clinical trials. We've even got a guideline, a published guideline on how to make a clinical trial in small populations. And that's one of the things that's really unique to Europe. So having this kind of open dialogue with the regulators without bringing them into the process, because after all, they are a gatekeeper to make sure that they keep us all honest, all of us, without bringing them too far in, but bringing them sufficiently in to give the advice so that they make sure we're on the right track, and they help us to be as successful as possible.
And maybe it's not only, sorry Mike, just to, and maybe the benefit too, because these tend to be such poorly understood diseases, I think it's not only to get their advice, but to use these opportunities to really help educate them about the disease itself and some of the challenges that are faced in studying them in a clinical development setting. So hopefully that exchange can be both ways.
Yeah. Good point. I think you're right. Partners is probably too big a word for the regulators to accept in any way, but to feel that they have understanding and expertise or have learned about the disease course, because it's very difficult. I can imagine trying to understand 7,000 rare conditions, but also to try to have someone on your side in there that really understands and tries to understand some of the difficulties and outcomes with regard to a disease that is progressive and debilitating. What is benefit? What does that look like? And when you have children that are progressing and at a certain moment are in sort of a cliff, and at that point you really can't bring them back in terms of an outcome such as walking, but you could really improve their lives if they could turn over in bed, for instance, which isn't a validated outcome. But to understand that there has to be some flexibility in understanding what outcomes increase the quality of life and improve their lifespan. So I think that having a shared interaction that is open, not necessarily considered partnerships, but certainly proactive on both sides would really be useful.
Do you find that the patient groups, because there's no kind of a commercial angle, that you find it easier to have that relationship with the regulators and to have those discussions?
No, actually, I mean, we certainly can interact with regulators on a different level in terms of conferences or meetings or have interactions with them. But once a drug is in process, right, they aren't going to speak to that drug. You aren't able to go and, if a drug is in trial, you aren't able to have a conversation with the regulators, because that's sort of perceived as promoting or trying to change judgment. So once the drug is in trial, it's sort of blocked off.
Yeah, I was thinking more actually before it gets into the trial. The whole concept of the trial design, because it seems to me that seems to be a kind of stumbling block for orphan drug development in the first place. We
certainly try to have regular interactions where we try to inform them about the disease course, about how it affects them, about how the clinical variability impacts these diseases. And in fact, for instance, on one of the primary outcomes used in some of the trials has been the 6-minute walk test, which the FDA is quite used to. But what I think none of us were aware of is that some of the behaviors of the boys impact the 6-minute walk test. So they may have these confounding behaviors that are concerned about the surroundings of the test, let alone the test itself. And so I think just to understand the nuances we're just learning about, to try to get them to be a bit flexible would be helpful. So yes, we interact with them on an informal basis, not when a drug is in trial in terms of trying to persuade them one way or the other. But I think there has to be this, the regulatory body has to understand the patient's view of this disease and what benefit might look like.
And I think on top of that, excuse me, it's one more point.
I wanted to ask you a question, actually.
Yeah, well, probably not the same thing, actually, but a regulatory body who really would like to have all the answers when a file is submitted, that's where I think the inconsistency in the rare disease space comes in. Not every single question, every single question can be asked, but not every single question can be answered. And that's where this long-term follow-up, also after regulatory approval, is important. Registries come in there, continuous interactions with patient organizations and the companies involved. So it's really this long-term commitment also in that respect. If regulators are willing to accept that point, that at the moment of submitting a file, maybe quite some more work still is to be done, then I think that's where the common sense comes in.
And I was thinking about this idea of having a group of people, partners being too big a word, as you said quite rightly, but a group of people who are kind of dedicated to understanding the rare disease space. And of course in Europe, that's the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products. So a group of experts from the individual member states brought together before the CHMP, the normal Human Medicines Committee reviews it, you have the COMP. And I think that's an expertise basis that has been created and has been added to over the years, over the 10 years of the regulation. So I was wondering how your experience has been on working with the COMP as kind of your advisor, or are they much more of a sounding board as you start to think about a common sense approach to developing treatments for these young patients in severe unmet medical need?
Yeah. The COMP, but also the Office of Orphan Drugs Development in the US, they're quite useful bodies to talk to as well. Yet on the other hand, are we completely there? No. The same point you made earlier about pediatrics, the fact that we are working on a children's disease, we are studying young men, young boys in clinical trials, but at the same time, we will still have to submit all kinds of other documents in order to comply with the pediatric regulations. I mean, a COMP or any other body, we are sharing that information, but so far, a lot needs to be done there still in order to overcome some of those challenges we're facing here.
Are there some examples of sort of best practice where something actually has worked in terms of innovative clinical trial design, something where it was suggested and it's worked, you've got the outcome? I mean, you mentioned the fact that you're working on these subtypes. What kind of success have you had to get the regulators to accept that actually maybe the data are additive?
Well, so far the regulators have told us that indeed, if once the first two products for the Duchenne from our pipeline will be okay, will be safe and effective, then the other ones will meet an easier pathway. But the point is, we are developing number 3, 4, 5, and 6 right now, and those development pathways are in design right now. So it's still a challenge one way or another. So is there a best practice? I think the fact that there is willingness to understand and to listen to our reasoning, absolutely, that's best practice. How it will work out in practice still needs to be seen.
And we've also touched on the fact that there's a need for collaboration with the regulators to have some sort of kind of harmonisation. What actually still needs to be done, and who should be taking the lead on that? I mean, should it be the patient groups, or is it the pharma industry, or is it already, bodies like COMP are actually already sort of linking up with their colleagues, and they're going to come up with something anyway?
I feel like the pressure needs to come from a lot of different constituents in order to create the momentum that's necessary for real harmonization to take place, and I think that will be importantly from patient organizations, advocacy groups, who are really trying to have patients on a global basis get access to drugs more quickly. But I think it will take industry pressure as well to try to encourage the agencies to look for areas to make the process more efficient and get drugs to patients more quickly around the world.
I mean, to Theresa and Pat's point earlier about the role of the, it being equally as important for the regulators to listen to the patient advocacy groups and the companies. Hans spoke about the size of trials earlier and the number of patients. Another thing is timelines for the outcomes, which I think you also mentioned briefly. Rare diseases are often chronic and progressive, and you have a clinical trial that has to be a finite amount of time, and patients are needing the therapies, and you can't necessarily monitor for 10 years to get an outcome, which a lot of these illnesses have high mortality rates and so on. So it's understanding from the patients via the companies and advocacy groups what is also a good outcome to look at in a shorter time frame of 12 months, 18 months. What should we be looking for? And I think so timelines are critical for regulators to consider to help get the drugs to the patients quicker.
And I think it's difficult in a rare disease to pick a single outcome, a primary outcome measure, right? Because you have so many confounding factors. And in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there is such clinical heterogeneity because all of these boys are different. And so it seems to me that if we could agree on perhaps a composite score, right, where the boy would be his own control. And so then you could really mark improvement, because if he improved in 6 out of 10 arenas, for instance, then that would be a much better argument than a single primary outcome measure, which is going to be variable based on many factors, not just disease course. So I think in some of the experiences in terms of just dynamics of a trial, if the clinical coordinator leaves or is sick and there's somebody else comes in, or the different clinician, or the time of the day. I mean, I think there's so many factors here that confound the ability to do a rigorous trial in a small population. And I think if we could think and work with regulators to have very novel trials, composite scores, or some agreement on where the bar should be set, so that we understand clearly, or as clearly as possible in a finite period of time, whether this drug has an impact. Not predict that it has to be gigantic impact, because if we look at rare disease and we talk about usually a lifespan that's very shortened, very dramatically shortened, and skills lost and gained, and not to be, or got lost and gained and lost again, I think that this is really a very important reason why we have to be collaborators, because none of us are experts in this disease, right? And we have to learn as we go, which is difficult. It's different than blood pressure. If you get 10 drops, 10 millimeters of mercury drop, then okay, you've lowered the blood pressure across the population. It's far different in rare disease, and I think that requires thoughtful partnerships. We couldn't use the word with the regulators, but an interaction of all of the players, so that we are really giving the best possible chance of success to the drugs coming.
Because the equation is simple. Every month that a company developing these compounds, or a regulator reviewing the data, or a payer trying to come to cost effectiveness, which very often is not the case, by the way, in these treatments, every month that one of these organizations is taking more time than needed in order to bring these products to patients, because it's an unmet medical need, will die. And that equation should be at the forefront of any decision making in companies about development pathways, but also at regulatory bodies in creating access.